They say the dead don't speak, but what if they do? And what if answering them is the worst mistake you could ever make? Daniel thought he was just hearing things, the whisper in the dark, a voice on the phone. But what started as a strange coincidence became a nightmare he could never escape. There's one rule people have followed for centuries: never answer the dead. But what happens when they don't give you a choice? Tonight, you will hear a story so disturbing, so real, that by the end, you'll question everything you thought you knew about death and what comes after. Tonight, you will hear a story so disturbing, so real, that by the end, you'll question everything you thought you knew about death and what comes after. But be warned, some doors, once open, can never be closed. It started with a whisper. Daniel Mercer had lived alone for years. His house, a century-old structure tucked away in the outskirts of Maine, was meant to be a place of solitude, a retreat where he could work on his crime stories without interruption. But lately, the silence had become heavy, suffocating, and then the whispering began. At first, he thought it was his imagination, an odd trick of the wind slipping through the old wooden beams. But one night, as he sat at his desk, the whisper became a voice that came from the dark corner of his living room. Daniel, the sound was barely audible, like a breath brushing against his ear. He froze, every muscle in his body locking into place. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. No one, just the glow of his desk lamp and the flickering shadows it cast against the walls. He swallowed hard, telling himself it was exhaustion playing tricks on him. He had been writing for hours, immersed in the gruesome details of a new story. Maybe he needed sleep, but sleep never came easy in that house. The next night, the whispering returned. This time, it wasn't just his name. It was something else. A single sentence, repeated over and over again, slipping through the walls like a draft from a forgotten past. "Why did you leave me?" Daniel's breath hitched. He hadn't told anyone. But those were the last words his wife had said to him before the accident. The words had haunted him for years. But no one else knew them. No one. His rational mind fought for control. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was some bizarre sleep-deprived hallucination. He forced himself to ignore it, convincing himself that if he didn't respond, it would stop. But it didn't stop. The voice grew stronger, louder. It followed him from room to room, whispering behind him, breathing against his neck. "Why did you leave me?" He stopped writing, stopped eating properly. The house, once his refuge, had become a prison of echoes and unseen presences. And then one night, the phone rang. A shiver crawled up his spine as he stared at the old landline sitting on his desk. He barely used it. Hardly anyone even had the number. The ringing continued. With hesitant fingers, he picked up the receiver and brought it to his ear. Silence. Then, Daniel. The voice was unmistakable. His wife. His blood ran cold. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no words. Static crackled on the line. Then the whisper returned, dripping with sorrow and something darker, something hungry. "Why did you leave me?" Daniel slammed the phone down, his heart hammering. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But deep down he knew this was only the beginning. Daniel couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, his wife, Emily, standing in the shadows of their old home. Her eyes hollow, her face pale, lips parted as if about to speak, but no words came out. He woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for air. He couldn't do this anymore. The next morning, he tried to convince himself that it was all in his head. Maybe grief was catching up to him. Maybe isolation had finally taken its toll. He needed fresh air, a distraction. He drove into town, stopping at a small diner he used to visit with Emily. The smell of coffee and bacon should have been comforting, but everything felt distant, like he was walking through a dream. "Daniel?" The voice startled him. He turned to see Martha, the elderly waitress who had worked there for as long as he could remember. "You okay?" she asked, pouring him a cup of coffee without waiting for his answer. He hesitated. The truth sounded insane. "Yeah," he lied. "Just tired." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "You still living in that house?" He frowned. "Yeah, why?" Martha sighed, lowering her voice. "That place has a history, you know." Daniel stiffened. He had never been the superstitious type, but something about the way she said it made his stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" She glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening. "They say the dead don't rest easy there." A chill ran down his spine. He forced a laugh. "Sounds like a ghost story." Martha didn't smile. "All I'm saying is, if you hear something calling your name, don't answer." Daniel felt his breath catch. His fingers clenched around the coffee cup. "How do you know that?" he asked. Martha hesitated, then simply said, "Just be careful." That night, the whispers returned. He locked every door, every window, left every light on, but it didn't matter. The voice seeped through the walls, through the very air around him. "Daniel," he covered his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. "Why did you leave me?" His breathing turned ragged. His pulse pounded in his ears. Then bang! A deafening noise from the front door. Something was knocking. Slow, deliberate. Daniel's body went rigid. The air in the room turned ice cold. The knocking came again. And then a voice. Not from the door. Not from the walls. From right behind him. "Let me in." Daniel's entire body locked in place. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He didn't want to turn around. He couldn't. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to stay still, to not acknowledge it. But then, the voice spoke again, closer this time. "Let me in, Daniel." A whisper, barely audible. Yet it felt like it was being spoken directly into his ear. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. He needed help. Someone, anyone. But just as his fingers brushed the screen, the power went out. Total darkness. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, the silence stretching unbearably around him. And then, from somewhere in the pitch-black void of his house, soft, shuffling footsteps. They were slow, measured, moving toward him. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be real. His mind scrambled for logic, for reason. Maybe it was an intruder. Maybe someone had broken in. But deep down he knew this wasn't human. The air grew thick, suffocating. A smell filled the room. Damp earth and something metallic, something rotten. Daniel forced himself to move. He reached for the flashlight in the drawer by his desk, fumbling with shaking hands. The footsteps stopped. Silence. He clicked the flashlight on. A beam of weak, flickering light cut through the darkness, casting long shadows against the walls. His living room was empty. The front door was still shut, but the air felt wrong. Then his phone vibrated in his hand. A call. No caller ID. Daniel stared at the screen, paralyzed. The number was blank. His throat was dry, his pulse hammering in his ears. And yet, against every ounce of reason, his thumb moved. He answered. At first, there was nothing, just static. Then, breathing, slow, wet, labored. Daniel, his blood turned to ice. Emily's voice. But something was wrong. It wasn't just Emily. There was something else behind her voice. A second whisper, a second breath layered beneath hers, distorting it. "Why did you leave me?" Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. "This isn't real," he whispered. A low, broken laugh crackled through the speaker. Then turn around. The line went dead. Daniel's breath hitched. His body was locked in place, every muscle screaming at him not to obey. But something changed in the air. A pressure, a presence. Slowly, he turned the flashlight toward the doorway behind him. The beam flickered, and for the briefest, most horrifying moment, he saw her, Emily, standing in the hallway, But her face was all wrong. Sunken, distorted, her mouth too wide, her eyes too black. A grotesque echo of the woman he had once loved. And she was smiling. Daniel staggered backward, a strangled cry escaping his throat. His foot caught on the rug, and he crashed to the floor. The flashlight rolled out of his hand, its beam spinning wildly around the room. When the light finally landed back on the hallway, she was gone. The only thing left was silence, and the door to his bedroom, wide open. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at the open doorway. He hadn't left it open. He knew that for certain. His mind raced, searching for an explanation that wouldn't make him lose his grip on reality. But there wasn't one. The air in the room was thick, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. He forced himself to move, crawling toward the fallen flashlight. His fingers brushed against the cold metal just as, thump, a dull, heavy sound came from the bedroom. Daniel froze. Something was in there. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get out of the house and never look back. But some sick part of him, some desperate, grieving part, needed to see, needed to know. He pushed himself up, his legs unsteady, and stepped toward the bedroom. The hallway felt longer than before, the shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. His pulse pounded in his ears. As he reached the doorway, the smell hit him. Rot, damp earth, something sour and wrong. The flashlight flickered. Daniel raised it slowly, hesitantly. The beam landed on the bed, and there she was, Emily, lying on the mattress, her body twisted unnaturally, her limbs sprawled in ways that weren't human. Her hair was wet, strands clinging to her pale face. Her lips curled into that awful, too wide smile. Her eyes snapped open. "Why did you leave me?" Daniel stumbled backward. His breath caught in his throat. Then she moved. Not like a person, not like anything alive. Her body jerked upright, as if some unseen force had pulled her by invisible strings. Her limbs dangled for a moment before snapping into place. The sound of cracking joints filled the air. Daniel bolted. He ran, through the hallway, past the living room, toward the front door. Slam. The door shut before he could reach it. His own house had turned against him. Daniel spun around, his back pressed to the door, his chest rising and falling in panicked gasps. The flashlight flickered in his shaking hand. The bedroom door creaked open. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the hallway. She was coming. Daniel's mind raced. Don't answer. Don't respond. Don't acknowledge her. But she was getting closer. And then she laughed. Low at first, almost a breath. Then it grew, swelling into something unnatural. A distortion of Emily's voice, layered with something else. Something ancient. Something wrong. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. And then silence. When he opened his eyes, the house was still. No footsteps. No laughter. Emily was gone. But just as a breath of relief left his lips, something brushed against his ear. A whisper. Cold. Icy. So close it felt like it was inside his head. Next time, I won't ask. The lights flickered back on. The house was empty. But Daniel knew the truth. She wasn't gone. And she would be back. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat in the corner of his living room, knees drawn up, gripping the flashlight, so tightly his knuckles turned white. The house was silent again, but it wasn't the comforting kind of silence. It was the silence of something waiting. He thought about leaving, grabbing his keys, getting in his car, driving as far as the gas tank would take him. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't matter. This wasn't just about the house. This was about him. Emily, or whatever had taken her form, wasn't bound to these walls. She had come for him, and she wouldn't stop. The hours dragged on. At some point, exhaustion won. His eyelids grew heavy, and despite the terror gripping his body, he dozed off. And that's when the dream started. Daniel found himself standing in a familiar place. Their old house, the one he and Emily had lived in before she died. Everything looked exactly as he remembered. The faded blue couch, the bookshelves filled with crime novels, the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. But something was wrong. The house felt empty, hollow, like an abandoned set from a forgotten play. Then he heard it, a dripping sound. He turned toward the kitchen. A trail of water led across the floor, dark and spreading, soaking into the wood. And there, in the dim light, stood Emily, dripping wet. Her clothes clung to her body, her hair hanging in heavy strands over her face. Her skin was pale, her lips tinged blue, like she had just crawled out of a lake. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Emily? She lifted her head. Her eyes, empty, black, bottomless. Why did you leave me? Her voice wasn't a whisper this time. It was angry, accusing. The house around him began to warp. The walls stretched. The floor creaked under some unseen pressure. The light above flickered violently. And then she lunged. Daniel woke up screaming. The room was dark, his heart slamming against his ribs. His hands clawed at his chest as if trying to push away something that wasn't there. It took him a full minute to realize where he was. But just as he caught his breath, his phone buzzed. A new voicemail. With shaking hands, he picked up the phone and pressed play. Static. Then her voice. Soft, distant, but unmistakably hers. You can't ignore me forever, Daniel. The message ended, and then a single knock on the front door. Slow, deliberate, and then another. Daniel's stomach twisted into a knot. A final knock. Louder, heavier, and then the door unlocked. A click, a slow creak, and the door swung open. Daniel's breath was shallow, ragged. The word tonight dripped down the screen, like ink dissolving in water. His mind screamed at him to leave, to get out of the house, to run, but something kept him rooted in place. Was it fear, or something deeper? A sick part of him, the part that had spent years drowning in grief and guilt, wondered, did he deserve this? He forced the thought away. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the flashlight. He needed to move, to do something. Daniel stumbled toward his desk, yanking open a drawer. He fumbled past notebooks and loose papers until his fingers found it, a small, cold object at the bottom, a revolver. It was old, barely used. He had bought it years ago, after Emily's death, in a moment of paranoia when the silence of the house had felt too heavy. He checked the cylinder, fully loaded. His breath steadied. Not much, but enough. Then, a sound, a single, deliberate tap against the window. Daniel's stomach twisted. The window was just a few feet away. The curtains were drawn, but the thin fabric barely masked the shifting shadows beyond. Tap, tap, tap. Slower this time, like it wanted him to come closer. He gripped the revolver tighter, forcing himself to move. Step by step, he approached the window. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to turn around, to not look. But he had to. With one final breath, he yanked the curtain aside, and his heart nearly stopped. Emily was standing outside, soaking wet, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes locked onto his. A twisted, sickening grin stretched across her face. Water dripped from her fingers, splattering onto the windowsill. Her lips moved. At first, no sound came out. But then, a whisper, muffled through the glass. Let me in. Daniel stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. His pulse pounded in his skull. His vision swam with panic. Then, the whisper changed, became something deeper. Not just Emily's voice. Something underneath it. Something ancient. You owe me. Daniel's grip on the gun tightened. No, he muttered. His voice cracked. You're not real. The thing outside pressed a hand to the glass. The skin was pale, translucent. Water pooled at her feet. She grinned wider. I'm closer than you think. Then the lights cut out. Total darkness. And from somewhere inside the house, a slow, wet footprint hit the floor. Then another. Getting closer. Daniel raised a gun, aiming blindly into the dark. His voice barely above a whisper. Where are you? A breath against his ear. Right here. Daniel spun around, pulling the trigger. Bang! The gunshot ripped through the darkness, deafening in the silence. The muzzle flash illuminated the room for a split second, and there was nothing there. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps. His pulse pounded in his ears. He swallowed hard, trying to listen over the ringing in his skull. The house was too quiet. No footsteps, no whisperers. But she was here, somewhere. The air was thick with damp, rotting decay, pressing in on him from all sides. He took a shaky step forward, gun raised. Then a sound, a slow, wet drip, 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 coming from above. Daniel's stomach twisted. He didn't want to look, didn't need to look, but his head lifted on its own. The ceiling, and hanging there, just above him, was her, Emily, twisted, contorted, pressed against the ceiling like some grotesque insect. Her limbs splayed at unnatural angles. Her wet, matted hair dangled toward him, and her face, her mouth was moving, but the voice came from behind him. You can't run from me. Daniel whirled around, and the house collapsed into darkness. The walls stretched, warped. The floor beneath him felt like it was sinking, melting into something deeper, something endless. A sound rose up around him, a chorus of whispers, dozens, maybe hundreds of voices overlapping, echoing, drowning out his thoughts. He staggered backward, his breath catching in his throat. Stop, he croaked. Just stop. The whispers laughed. Then the world snapped back into focus. The room was still. The house normal, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. Daniel felt it, a shift in the air, a weight pressing against his chest, like something had crawled inside of him, like something had stayed. And then his phone buzzed, a new voicemail. Hands trembling, he lifted the phone and pressed play. Static, then a whisper, soft, familiar, but not Emily's. Not anymore. See you soon. The message ended. The house was silent. Daniel stood there, staring at the phone, knowing deep down it wasn't over, not even close. Daniel spun around, pulling the trigger. Bang! The gunshot ripped through the darkness, deafening in the silence. The muzzle flash illuminated the room for a split second, and there was nothing there. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps. His pulse pounded in his ears. He swallowed hard, trying to listen over the ringing in his skull. The house was too quiet. No footsteps, no whisperers. But she was here, somewhere. The air was thick with damp, rotting decay, pressing in on him from all sides. He took a shaky step forward, gun raised. Then a sound, a slow, wet drip, 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 coming from above. Daniel's stomach twisted. He didn't want to look, didn't need to look, but his head lifted on its own. The ceiling, and hanging there, just above him, was her, Emily, twisted, contorted, pressed against the ceiling like some grotesque insect. Her limbs splayed at unnatural angles. Her wet, matted hair dangled toward him, and her face, her mouth was moving, but the voice came from behind him. You can't run from me. Daniel whirled around, and the house collapsed into darkness. The walls stretched, warped. The floor beneath him felt like it was sinking, melting into something deeper, something endless. A sound rose up around him, a chorus of whispers, dozens, maybe hundreds of voices overlapping, echoing, drowning out his thoughts. He staggered backward, his breath catching in his throat. Stop, he croaked. Just stop. The whispers laughed. Then the world snapped back into focus. The room was still. The house normal, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. Daniel felt it, a shift in the air, a weight pressing against his chest, like something had crawled inside of him, like something had stayed. And then his phone buzzed, a new voicemail. Hands trembling, he lifted the phone and pressed play. Static, then a whisper, soft, familiar, but not Emily's. Not anymore. See you soon. The message ended. The house was silent. Daniel stood there, staring at the phone, knowing deep down it wasn't over, not even close.